Hey, everybody. We'll get started in just about a minute. I'll be right back. Then we'll get the show on the road. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to my final guest lecture for the NACCL. I hope everybody's having a fun and successful season. I will open the floor up today in the last 10 minutes or so for a Q&A. I know that a lot of you had questions that I was not able to get to in the previous few lectures, so I'll try to give you 7 to 10 minutes at the end for sort of general Q&A. So if you have any questions about the previous lecture topics or any topic at all, please save that question for the end. Without further ado, I will share my screen. And let's get started with two really, really cool studies. And then we'll proceed with a couple of positions that we weren't able to get to in the last couple of lectures. So first, a warm-up study that I find to be really beautiful. It's not long, but conceptually, I think it's very, very cute. It is white to play, and the goal is to win the game by force, not necessarily through checkmate. Simply, the goal is to attain a winning position. And it is white to move. So as usual, for those of you who are new to the lectures, we'll be using Zoom chat for communication. Please make sure that you're muted so that there's no background noise, and please feel free to ask questions or brainstorm moves at any point through the Zoom chat. White to play. Okay, so in the interest of time, this is a pretty difficult study. Like the main concept is tough, so I'm going to help you guys along. And I hate to rush people, but we've got quite a few positions to get to. So you look at this position, and the first thing that I would do, even before generating candidate moves, is to try to understand sort of generally what could victory in this position look like? Like what could be the objective of this position? And looking at this, just sort of intuitively, two things come to mind. You could probably imagine that there's going to be some mating constructions because there's a close proximity of your piece tandem with Black's king. And the second type of win is going to be a knight fork against Black's queen. Like you can imagine that maybe in some cases you could force the king onto a forkable square, and then there could be some sort of a knight fork. And it always helps to keep that in mind because that kind of guides your thinking. Now to the question of candidate moves. So one observation that I would make is that the white king is extremely vulnerable. So if it were Black to move, Black would start checking the king with something like queen e7. So a move like a5 makes some sense, trying to chase the knight away, but it's a little bit too open-ended. Black can play queen e7 check. Black could even, in some cases, sacrifice the knight, and queen and knight versus king is a theoretical draw. I think queen b7 might be the most clinical, and the win is starting to slip away from white. So that essentially guides us in the direction of trying to deliver a check on the first move, and there's really only one check that makes sense. Okay, maybe Botez would be partial to queen a8, but we won't discuss that move. The correct move is, in fact, queen c6 check, bringing the queen to a superior attacking square and forcing king b8. The second move, I think, is also quite logical. Note that the tempting knight c5 trying to get to a6, it fails because Black has a very nasty check on c4. So the second move can also be derived sort of logically. Second move is also a check. There is only one logical check, and that is queen d6. And already we can kind of start reaping the fruits of our initial reasoning, in the sense that king b7 fails to a knight fork. King b7, knight d8 forks the king and the queen. But of course, Black is not going to go to b7. Black is going to go either to a8 or to c8. And as a small hint, White's continuation is exactly the same after both of those moves. Now you need to find the kind of main kernel of this study. The main idea starts in this position. There's a beautiful and very unexpected tactical concept. Okay. So one of you is on a pretty promising path, but the topic of our first lecture was the kind of mindset which allows you to find creative solutions. And one of the most important things is to be an optimist over the board. So when you spot an idea that's promising, but it doesn't quite work, it's worth taking another 10, 15 seconds at the end of the line to make sure that you're not stopping too soon, that the idea you're about to reject isn't, in fact, the correct continuation, especially if it comes very, very close to working. So again, some of you are proposing a move like a5. But again, I think the problem is that it's too slow. And of the several defenses the black has here, I like queen e7, which I think is an elegant way to force a draw. Because if you take the queen, then knight d5 will pick up the queen with a draw. And if white plays knight c7, I'm pretty sure that white actually loses due to queen takes c7. Same concept of a fork on d5. Bad. So queen c6 check is a move repetition, which leaves us with the most logical candidate move, queen d8 check. And after king b7, the critical position arises. And John, together with Matt, kind of derived the correct idea. Here you should notice that the king and the queen are both unforkable squares. And so if the queen on d8 were somehow magically replaced with a knight, but of course without giving up the queen, then white would win. But it turns out that you can give your queen up, but not in its entirety. You can give the queen up for black's knight. The correct sequence is queen takes b6, vacating the d8 square. Very importantly, after a takes b6, knight d8, black has no way to rid white of the a pawn. After king a6, knight takes f7, if the white king were shifted one square down, then black would have b5, liquidating into king and knight against king. So therefore, black has to take with the king, and this is the position which some of you might have reached in your head and thought, well, there's no more knight fork, so there's no way that this can work. But the king is an extremely vulnerable piece, and you have just enough resources to force the king back to a vulnerable, forkable square. You push the pawn up to a5, and the beautiful finale is king a6, knight c5, checkmate. And all three pieces participate in the sudden mating net. And if black slides over to c6 or b7, then our old friend, knight d8, wins the game with a fork against black's king. Yeah, so the full solution is queen c6, queen d6, trying to force the king onto b7. That is the theme of the study. King c8 or king a8, same thing. You give the check on d8. You sacrifice the queen on b6 to vacate the square, and then you drive the king onto a compromised square where it can be either forked or checkmated. Okay, good stuff. On we go to one more study, and we haven't done this type of study in the NACCL lectures thus far. I'm a big fan of them. I think they develop certain types of skills that aren't always well developed by solving kind of regular puzzles. And I'm talking about puzzles where you have to checkmate in a certain number of moves. Now, most people's association with that term is very basic puzzles where it's like queen and king against king. And some of you might be thinking, well, I know how to checkmate, with two queens against a king or with queen and king against king. But what makes these studies sometimes the most difficult types is that you have to checkmate in a certain number of moves. And that's where the beauty comes from. So in this position, it's white to play and checkmate in 4 moves. Now, obviously, white is winning. And if all you needed to do was win the game, then all you would have to do is just avoid stalemate, right? Black's king is currently stalemated, so you would have to make a move like bishop d7. Hint, this is not the correct first move. And white is 2 bishops up. But to checkmate in specifically 4 moves, you will need to apply quite a bit of creative thinking, and you will need to carry out a really, really lovely idea that I think helps build both resilience of thinking as well as imagination and creativity. Take a stab at it, white to play, and checkmate by force in 4 moves. Typically in these studies, you get the reverse of what you would get in a normal study, where sometimes the first move is pretty natural, and then the kernel or the beautiful idea occurs 3 or 4 moves into the line. Here, in these types of studies, typically the first move is the hardest. Like the first move doesn't come to mind because it might look absurd or counterproductive. But then once you start considering it, it becomes a lot easier to follow the line until its conclusion. Remember that in most cases, if you let the black king escape toward the center, if the black king ends up on f5 or f6, there's going to be no way to cover all of the escape routes, so you're not going to mate in 4 moves. You need to keep the king confined to the side of the board. That is kind of the fundamental guideline that you have to operate by. You can't let the king access f4 or f5 or any of these squares. And a very interesting idea proposed. Okay, let's consider it. So Eileen proposes bishop h5, sacrificing the bishop. Black is obliged to take. King takes h5. Now king takes h7 would be stalemate. So correct is king to g7. Black has only 1 legal move. And now finish it. Put the black king to bed in 2 more moves. Remember, this is mate in 4. Okay, so John, that's not mate because of king h5. Very good. Python got it. King f6, forcing the black king further into the depths of hell. And now the king slides over to g6, cutting off the escape back to h5. This is checkmate. Yeah, this should be a Rosen trophy. Something tells me, yeah, moving the king. I'm sure that there are Rosen trophies connected with like discover checks, but a discover check where you move the king away holds a particular place, I think, in most players' hearts. This is mate in 4. And so very, very nice. You start with a bishop sacrifice in order to avoid all the stalemates. Force the king to h5. King g7. Now, again, black's king is stalemated. You have to cut your own diagonal in order to give the king another square. And then you slide over to g6 with checkmate. Okay. Very well done. Let's move on to a couple of positions that I wasn't able to get to in the previous couple of lectures, which I think you'll kind of enjoy, and we'll talk through them gradually. And then again, I'll leave the last couple of minutes open for questions. Toby says, I was too busy being stubborn on moves that didn't work. And that's an important thing to do when you're solving studies, is to recognize when you're in a rut. In general, you know, why do people freeze on certain positions? Like sometimes, you know, you can sense yourself moving closer and closer to the solution. And then there's other times that you're solving a puzzle and you know that you're completely stuck. So that metacognition of understanding when you're completely stuck and why you're stuck is very, very important. And one of the reasons that we get stuck is that subconsciously we formulate our list of candidate moves very, very quickly, like within a couple of seconds, and we keep cycling through them again and again and again. And we don't even realize that we're not actually incorporating new information about the position. We're just, you know, keeping our wheels spinning rather than generating new candidate moves and trying to approach the position in a new way. So the topic of the first position that I'd like to examine, and we're actually going to take black's perspective here, is going to be the ability to not get overwhelmed by the ostensible complexity of the position. the ability to sift through the components of the position logically and to find an incredibly powerful move and to kind of deconstruct a position that might seem completely overwhelming when you look at it first. And this is a game, unsurprisingly, there's an unsurprising component to this and a surprising component. Unsurprisingly, Mikhail Tal was involved in this game. Surprisingly, he was on the black side of this game, even though knowing Tal's reputation, you might think that he was white. He was actually black, so he was on the receiving end of a queen sacrifice in the opening, and this crazy position occurs a couple of moves later. So white is down a full queen. White currently doesn't even have a minor piece for the queen. And you can count on one hand like the amount of instances where this kind of thing happens and the side that has the extra queen actually does not have an advantage. So the hint that I'll give you is that black can win the game or achieve a decisive advantage, but only with one move. This is a difficult move. I think it's a really beautiful move. And remember that chess beauty can come in several different shapes and sizes. Not all chess beauty necessarily is represented through sacrifices or mating combinations. There can be defensive beauty. There can be beauty that is achieved through depth. And that's the kind of aesthetic value that I personally derive out of Tal's move. So first thing I'll do is let everybody think, kind of adjust your eyes to this position, and try to come up with, at the very least, a candidate move or any piece of information or observation that can help us move closer to a potential resolution to all of the threats that are facing black in this position. You can take a couple of minutes just to think. All right, another 30 seconds, and then we'll start discussing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we have some very interesting thoughts. Thank you for engaging with this, head spinning position. So I'm going to read the comments quickly one by one. Being up a queen, I'd like to kick that bishop away with pawns. Okay, bishop c5 is tempting. I'm going to record the candidate moves that people are proposing. It attacks the rook and creates a much-needed escape square for the king. Arjun is recommending bishop d6. One knight is pinned and the other seems important as its defender. Yeah, that's one of the big issues. Rook c8 is proposed by Joe. Rohit says, get the queen out of the pin while maintaining defense at d5, maybe queen a5. Open escape square for the king, h6 or h5. Okay, very interesting set of candidate moves. Let's try to approach this position logically. So essentially, as I talked about earlier, what are some of the reasons that we tend to freeze? Well, one is that you keep your wheel spinning and you keep cycling through the same candidate moves. But in this position, the reason that one would freeze is just because the position is so overwhelming that you don't know where to start. And the key is just to start somewhere. It's not like a GM has a particular way of approaching each position that allows me to find the correct move with a high degree of certainty. I'm just like you, I look at a position like this and, my eyes start to hurt. And it's just that I tend to force certain thoughts out of myself. And that's what allows you to pull yourself up by the bootstrap. So the first thing I do is start with a couple of very basic questions. First question, what is white's actual threat? If it were white to move, this is how I like phrasing the question, by the way. I don't think this is made clear enough. It's made clear in chess literature how important it is to ask what the threat is. But the way I like to phrase that question is, what is my opponent's next move? That forces you to actually kind of concretize your answer to that question. White's next move is obviously g takes f6. Okay? So the logical next question is, well, why can't I move the f6 knight? And, well, that's pretty clear as well. White will play rook takes d5. I mean, at least bishop takes d5 wins the queen back, but rook takes d5 seems totally devastating because this is checkmate, and the discovered check is unstoppable. So that's not possible. So if we're not moving the knight on f6, that means that we're going to have to allow g takes f6. So the next question then becomes, well, how do I brace for impact? If g takes f6 is unstoppable, what needs to happen in order for g takes f6 to not carry as much devastation as it otherwise would? Well, let's dial it back for a second and ask ourselves why g takes f6 carries devastation. It's not because white takes a minor piece, right? Material considerations should not be at the top of your mind because we're up an entire queen. So hypothetically, even if we were to lose one knight and then we were to lose the other knight, if we were to somehow avoid getting checkmated, we would still be up a queen for two minor pieces. So that's not the issue. The issue is the placement of our king. And already I think the way that I've formulated these observations actually might lead you to the correct move if you understand how to apply that question and get it to work for you. But now let's consider a couple of the candidate moves that unfortunately don't work. So queen a5 is an interesting thought. Unfortunately, it does not address the underlying problems of g takes f6. Rook takes d5 is still threatened. f7 mate is also a threat. This is another important observation. But even if it wasn't, I think the situation is dire. If you play g takes f6, the other rook could come into the game. I would already stop calculating here. I think it's pretty clear to us intuitively that mate is inevitable. I mean, bishop, just look at this position. Everything is falling. Rook d8 mate is threatened. The position collapses. Rook c8 is an interesting thought. But again, if you've noticed that g takes f6 carries the threat of f7 mate, then you'll notice that rook c8 is not as effective of a way to prevent it. Also mentioned, I think, was the move b5. But b5, again, g takes f6, and again, f7 is threatened. Bishop c5 is a pretty serious candidate move. This is the second best move, and it leads to an extremely unclear position, although I still think that, practically speaking, black is in big trouble after this move. Now, bishop c5 directly addresses the threat of g takes f6, because here, black will have bishop takes d4, and if you calculate onwards, f7, king f8, there is no clear follow-up. Black's king is safe. Black is up oodles of material. Unfortunately, white does not have to rush g takes f6, and white can simply drop the rook back to d1. And then the question becomes, well, what have we really achieved with the move bishop c5? Well, we've achieved a potential escape square for black's king. But just because the king reaches f8 does not mean that it's safe from the avalanche of pieces that surround it. For instance, if you try to escape preemptively, play king f8, I will play g takes f6. If you play queen takes f6, you're walking into a fork on d7. If you play g takes f6, well, then, okay, there's probably a couple of things that white can do. Probably at a minimum, rook takes d5 with a very, very powerful attack. Comes to mind, the knight is jumping into d7. This looks pretty unappetizing. But bishop c5 is clearly getting somewhere. So we've derived one of the techniques that we can use to take the sting out of g takes f6, which is essentially to guarantee safe passage for black's king. And I think this is leading most of you to come up with a candidate move that immediately disarms white's initiative. It's a very small move. And I think the beauty of this move precisely comes from the fact that it's sort of proverbially small. It doesn't look like anything special, and yet it accomplishes a great deal. I forget the quote that comes to mind, something like what did Neil Armstrong say when he landed on the moon? One small step for man, one great leap for mankind. So what about a great leap for black's king? Very good. Now, one of you already proposed this move earlier. The correct move and the winning move found by Tall is h6. This is the only winning move, and it ends white's initiative almost immediately. If I may ask. Okay, I muted it manually. So h6, what is the point of this move? Simple. We're making an escape square for the black king on h7. So if white stubbornly proceeds with g takes f6, we no longer have to play gf, compromising the positioning of our king. We can simply play queen takes f6. Because we don't care about the two knights, we're allowing white to capture it. So for example, either rook takes d5 or more likely bishop takes d5 has happened in the game. And after king h7, already you should begin to realize that white's initiative has fizzled out. That's it. There is nothing more to calculate. White is down a queen for two minor pieces. And on the next move, black can try to bring the bishop out to d6 and start harassing these vulnerable minor pieces in the center. There is only one other move, I think, to seriously consider here. And that is the response g6. But after g6, the attack on the f6 knight has been removed. So there is no more threat. There is no more immediate threat against the knight on d5. Now we can come back to our old friend bishop c5. We can force the rook back to d1. And for example, we could even move the king to f8. We could get the queen to e7. Without the threat of g takes f6, the threat of bishop takes d5 is no longer scary because we can simply play knight takes d5 and white's initiative fizzles out. So Michael asks, does g6 work for the same reason? So no, because after g6, I can play gf. And after queen takes f6, rook takes d5, or bishop takes d5. At the very least, after king g7, this seems like an inferior version of h6 because the king is still kind of caught in the crossfire. One thing that comes to mind here is knight f7. And who can spot my idea against queen takes d4? It's not what you might think it is. So take a moment here. It's not what you might think it is. So spend a moment here trying to understand what is the most that white can extract from this position. And it's not victory. So the mupwa, the most popular wrong answer, is bishop e5 forking the queen. But you always have to keep in mind the material count. After queen takes e5, white is simply down an exchange. So the correct answer is bishop h6 and bishop g5, chasing the king along the diagonal. And this is perpetual check with a draw. So for that reason, the only winning move, and you can see this with the engine, is h6. And there is a way to add lines on Lichess, and I forget how to do that. Multiple lines. There we go. You can see that the second best move is bishop c5, and there the position is equal. You have to find h6. Okay. Next position. And I think we'll only have time for probably one more before I take some questions. Now, I actually have forgotten if we got to this position before or not. I'm pretty sure we didn't. But if this is familiar to any of you, please let me know. I have an infinite number of positions I want to get to. This is a fairly obscure game that I think is both tremendously instructive and really, really beautiful. And it encompasses a wide range of concepts that I think aren't always effectively addressed when you solve online chess puzzles. So this is a game between Lev Millman, who is an international master. He almost became GM, doesn't play actively anymore, and 2300 FM with the black pieces. This came out of a Caro-Kann. Crazy position. Again, same type of concept where you're looking at the board and your eyes are just like all over the board. You're like, what do I even start with? So try to approach this position logically. Identify the threat. Try to make some sort of qualitative observations about the position and use that to guide you toward a candidate move that you then try to calculate out. White to play and achieve a decisive attack against black's king. Okay, I'll let people think. Okay, so let's start the discussion. All right, so let's start with a couple of banal observations. And Rohit, I like that format of bullet points. All of them are true. White has strong attack on the king. Queen is hanging. So black's, this is the easiest question. This is like the $100 question on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. What is black's next move? Yeah, queen takes c4 check. At some point, we want to do the rook lift to bring the last inactive piece into the game. So that's a thought, of course. It would be nice in some distant future if we could involve the h1 rook, but right now we have bigger fish to fry. And the biggest fish that we have to fry right now is, of course, that we have to decide what to do with our queen. And it's pretty clear that queen takes c6 is suicidal because black takes back with a pawn, immediately forking the rook and the knight. And without the queens on the board, the attack fizzles out. So that's out of the question. Are there any other captures? No, because the queen falls with check. So we know that we have to move the queen. And there seem to be two logical squares. If you just think, well, where can I put the queen to maximally contribute to the attack? Some of you proposed queen f3, sacrificing the bishop. Others proposed queen g4, sacrificing the rook. Now, when you compare these two moves, what is the more direct attacking attempt? What is the move that seems easier to calculate? Generally, in the confines of a blitz or rapid game, and even in a classical game, you always want to start with a move that's, I think the term forcing is a little bit misleading. I would modify that to what seems to be easier to calculate. And a line that's easier to calculate isn't always the more forcing line. It can always also be the more direct continuation, the continuation that poses a clear threat. And queen g4 poses a clear threat of bishop takes g7. So black's response here seems to be absolutely forced. I'll mention that queen f3 is not a terrible move, but white's attack is perhaps sufficient to compensate for the piece, but not more than that. I think after g takes h6, it's important to understand that the g7 square is permanently under black control. There's no way that you're deflecting the bishop out of f6, which means that you should probably go knight takes h6 check, garnering a second pawn for the piece. Okay, black goes king h8. It doesn't seem to my eyes that white's attack is anything special. Yeah, maybe you can drop the knight back to g4 and chase this bishop away, try to get the pawn to h6, but black can drop back to e7. The game continues, and it's anybody's game. I would probably prefer black here. I think white's compensation is maybe on the insufficient side. So let's calculate queen g4, and let's try to do it in our head. So Cathan gave some really good variations here. Queen g4, black has to play queen takes d5, and white plays bishop takes g7. And in this position, this is where knowledge of one specific tactical device will immediately help you generate black's most resilient defensive move. So after bishop takes g7, what construction is formulated along the g file? Well, it's a potential discovered check. And what most people don't intuitively understand about discovered checks is that in order to disarm and make a discovered check harmless, the best approach is always to attack the tail of the discovery. So in a discovered check, there is the piece that's giving the check and the piece that's moving away, that's discovering the check. In the case of a double check, both pieces are participating. But clearly, the dark squared bishop cannot discover a check on the king, which is on a light square. So black's best approach toward disarming that discovery is to attack the queen. Does black have the means to attack the queen on g4 so that when the bishop moves, black will be able to capture the queen and thereby remove the check? Now, when I phrase it that way, and this is the beauty of chess instruction, I think, anything can be found if the question is properly phrased. And when this happens, your focus shouldn't be on the move itself. It should be on the question that led up to the move. Because when asked again in a proper moment, that question can then allow you to find a similar move in a similar position. So when there's a discovered check and you're trying to disarm it, start by asking yourself, can I attack the tail of the discovery, the piece that's giving the check? Okay. So just a moment. Yeah. So queen g4, queen takes d5, bishop takes g7. The move that black made in the game, the move that black relied on, is knight c6 to e5. Excellent. Let's make those moves on the board. Queen g4, queen takes d5, bishop takes g7. Now, as Cathan pointed out correctly, queen takes f5 is a good defensive attempt, but it doesn't work because after queen takes f5, bishop takes g7, it may seem that black has garnered a lot of material for the queen, but that's beside the point. The point is that black's king is completely surrounded, h6. and the bishop has nowhere to go. It cannot stay on this diagonal because bishop h8 gets checkmated, h7 and queen g5 is a beautiful mating construction that's kind of worth remembering. And if the bishop stays in the center, then it can be chased backwards with f4. Either you have to allow Lolly's mate with queen g5, queen g7, or you have to go back to h8 and allow the aforementioned. I don't know what this is called. I want to say epaulet mate, but I'm definitely not a specialist in all the mate names. So therefore, we have narrowed down Black's defensive option to knight e5. In the game, Black started by giving a check on d3. White slid the king away to a1. And Black played knight e5, surely believing that he has fully disarmed the attack and that Black is now winning because there's clearly no way for White to use the discover check to produce something productive. What did Millman do in this position? And this is the beautiful finale of this combination that can definitely be hiding amongst the chaos that's going on the king side. And try to calculate this line up until checkmate. White is down a rook, so the success condition for this line has to be either checkmate or winning Black's queen. So try to calculate all the way down the line. First of all, important not to fall in love with your own ideas. There is a very tempting move here. And this move is made much more tempting because it's a queen sack. And subconsciously, I think we assign a lot more weight to ideas that contain some sort of aesthetic beauty. And we are less likely to approach them objectively because we're proud of ourselves for finding them. And h6 falls into that category. When you see this move, you think, I'm a great chess player. I might even be Hans Niemann one day. So h7 mate is threatened, knight takes g4, h7. But if you approach this objectively, Black was not born yesterday. Although, the GMs are younger and younger these days. I mean, I think we'll have a one-day-old GM soon. But Black is not just going to allow h7 mate. He's going to put the king on h7. And now White's attack is fully disarmed. The king is actually on the safest square on the board. The queen is hanging. There is no follow-up. So h6 is wrong. Knight h6 check again allows king h7. So it seems that White runs out of ideas, and yet, as Toby pointed out, there is the beautiful move knight f5 to e7 check. How do you spot this move? Well, the point and the observation that you have to make, first of all, in such positions, and I don't like that phrase, in such positions, it has a bad reputation as like something that lazy commentators say, like, what do you mean such positions? I'm referring to like very chaotic positions that have a tactical component. You have to consider all of the checks. And I feel like this is the most common advice that's shared, and yet it's almost never put into practice by most people. So I find that if you're missing a move like knight e7, it's probably because you're actually not following the rules. The rules dictate that in a highly tactical position, you have to force yourself to consider the captures and checks, particularly if there aren't a lot of them, right? So even if you're, part of your brain is trying to rule out moves that seem absurd, this is what I've been saying all along. In order to develop the ability to think creatively, you have to give certain moves a chance. You can't rule stuff out within the span of 2 seconds. The moment you start taking a move like knight e7 seriously, you start understanding that, wait a second, there's a point because the white bishop is x-raying Black's knight. So if Black takes, then suddenly you're able to eliminate the piece that was attacking the queen. The discovered check against the king is once again effective and will lead either to checkmate or to the loss of Black's queen. But of course, Black is not going to cooperate. Black is still going to play this devilish move, king h7. And who can spot the cherry on top? Excellent. Good job. Y'all are getting it. Queen g6 check. Now it's time for the queen sacrifice. In order to open the H file, HG, HG, a double attack. A double attack on the black king. Using the knight on e7 to guard the g6 pawn. King takes g7 and rook h7 is mate. That is indeed how the game ended. Again, just like in the studies that we started with, all of the pieces are participating in the mating construction, all three. Pawn on g6, rook on h7, knight on e7, they're all indispensable. And, they can only be doing this from the positions that they're on. And that is how the game ended. The entire sequence goes queen g4, queen e5, bishop g7, queen d3, king a1, knight e5. Now we refrain from the tempting h6. We refrain from the tempting knight h6. We give the check on e7. Whole board awareness, king h7 and queen g6 is a mating pattern. How do you find queen g6? I have no good answer to that. Basically, you need to be aware of common tactical patterns. Like a lot of you spotted queen g6 almost instantly, and that tells me that you're doing your puzzles, that you're solving regularly. That's the only way that you're going to spot these tactical patterns efficiently. There is no science to it. Whereas some moves can be found through logical thinking, and hopefully you were able to see that today. Other moves like queen g6 cannot be found through logical thinking. They can only be found through fine-tuning or pattern recognition. So if you didn't see queen g6, that just tells you you need to do more chess.com exercises. You need to try to more regularly solve puzzles that involve mating patterns. There's a lot of Chessable courses on it as well. I think now is the golden age of being able to essentially improve and optimize your skills in almost any area in chess. And on that note, I'm going to open up the floor for a couple of minutes before I wrap up for the final time. Any questions on really any topic at all? I'll try to get through as many as I can. No pressure. Again, if nobody has questions, we'll wrap up, but I'll give you a couple of moments to formulate them. And then I'll kind of share a couple final thoughts and release you all for the evening. Do I watch, Rohit asks, do I watch the NACCL games commentary? I think Gary does a great job. I will, on occasion, check some of the games. So yes, I'm aware of the results, and I will check into the stream from time to time. Was queen d3 necessary, asks Stan. So queen d3 was played in order to avoid a second winning idea. If black started with knight e5, here, white can play knight e7, king h7, and white has the additional resource, queen f5 check, moving the queen away from the line of fire of black's knight, and here you can just take the queen with a winning position. So queen d3 was played in order to ostensibly take the sting out of the move knight e7. Of course, it didn't turn out to. Yeah. Okay, I'll give people a couple more moments. So Toby asks, you're not playing in the US Championship right now. So just to clarify, the reason is because I didn't qualify by rating. I used to qualify by rating. It's not that I dropped. It's that a lot of people have changed federations in the intervening years. In 2021, I played because I got a wild card invitation. This year, I didn't. Will I play in it again, or am I mostly done with classical chess? So earlier, I was kind of, fence sitting on this question. But right now, given where online chess is at, and given how much more I like Blitz and Rapid than classical, I'm kind of taking a break from classical chess. It's incredibly stressful to try to combine maintaining your classical rating with, a streaming career and commentary and teaching. And, I realized that it wasn't bringing me much joy to play underrated kids in these tournaments with 2 rounds a day. So right now I'm focused more on the content side of things and focused on Blitz, which I'm more passionate about than ever. Maybe one day my mindset will change. I would never say that I'm retired forever. if an interesting tournament comes along and I feel like playing in it, I'll play in it. But for the time being, I've sort of moved toward the internet side of things, chess-wise. Okay. So we have Amit asked, do you recommend not playing Blitz until I improve in long-form chess? I would recommend doing what you enjoy the most first and foremost. Like, I think some people get a little bit too bogged down in, like, I have to hit this rating milestone, that rating milestone. I'm not going to allow myself to do this, to play X format before I improve in Y format. Ultimately, you should identify the format that you feel most passionately about improving in. If it's classical chess, great. But there's nothing wrong with saying, I like Blitz more than classical, so I'm going to put as my goal maximizing my 3+0 rating on chess.com. I think each person has their own favorite time control, and you should start by identifying the hierarchy of time controls that you want to get better in. Of course, it's also a symbiotic thing. If you improve in classical, you're probably going to improve in Blitz. But understanding what time control makes you most passionate helps you to determine what time control you should play on a regular basis as part of your training. Kathan asks, what time control is important? Feels like more and more tournaments are blitz-ish / rapid. I think that chess is moving toward a kind of 50-50 split. I think we're already there. I think we're at a 50-50 split financially and in terms of audience interest between blitz / rapid tournaments and classical tournaments. I think it's going to stay that way for a while. I don't think classical is going anywhere. I don't think the World Championship is going to be rapid anytime soon. At some point, we might hit like 60-40 or 70-30, but I'm good with 50-50. Like, you can basically be a full-time professional online player. And, for someone like me who has always been a huge blitz and bullet fanatic, that's kind of a dream scenario. That's what I've been waiting for what feels like decades. And, it's kind of finally there. Yeah, 10+2, 15+2, 3+1. There's a lot of time controls which recur again and again in modern day online tournaments. I think the mental habits you've taught in this course are super useful for classical and longer rapid games. Is there a way to apply them in faster rapid games and blitz games without getting flagged? So in blitz games, I would say that the top priority has to always be keeping an eye on your clock, right? You should constantly keep an eye on your clock. You should monitor your time, and everything goes out the window if you don't have enough time on your clock. So your top priority should be to practice your intuition and to trust your gut and to try to apply a kind of truncated version of some of these pieces of advice. But sometimes the more you apply certain things, the more automated the process becomes. And before you know it, that process is much more intuitive than it was at some point. So the short answer is no, not really. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about in these lectures is more applicable for longer form chess, but that doesn't mean you can't work it into your kind of intuitive reasoning that's very important in blitz. All right. One more question. Games to study. I'm happy to give the spot to Hans. Yeah, for sure. Where can we play money prize tournaments? So the best way to check is through the U.S. Chess Federation website. Just go to uscf.org. U.S. Chess Federation has a listing of tournaments by state. So you can click on the tournaments tab and you can find tournaments in your area. That'll list all of the USCF sanctioned tournaments in your area. And it'll generally have information on those tournaments, including prizes and, how to register, that kind of stuff. It's pretty intuitive. So, don't feel like playing a classical tournament is a huge thing. Like, it's not an anxiety-inducing environment. I think people in OTB chess are pretty welcoming to newbies. If you've played online a lot, you'll get your rating, and I think you'll have a good time. Classical tournaments can be really, really fun if, you don't have anything on the line. All right. On that note, I am going to call it a night. I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of your busy days and attending these lectures. It means a lot to me. I hope that everyone found something that they can take away from, these lectures. I know the examples are complicated. I try to make it engaging for players of different levels, but the active engagement really, really means a lot to me. I can tell that people are into it, and I had a blast, as I always do every season, doing these guest lectures. I will definitely be back next season. So thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Good luck in the final week in your NACCL games, and I hope to see you next season. Best of luck. Have a good evening, and goodbye.